Once upon a time, a king ruled a kingdom. He had a wise minister. The king trusted him more than anyone else. In the court, there were many courtiers. Among them, 3 were good friends: Robert, Charlie, and Louis. Not far from the capital, a man named Jonathan lived with his daughter in the forest. Jonathan raised a flock of sheep and sold their wool in the market to earn a living. One evening, a servant led a man into Robert's chamber. The man bowed.
"Sir, I have an important message for you."
Robert gestured to a chair.
"Sit. Bring tea quickly,"
he ordered the servant. The servant hurried away and soon returned with tea and refreshments. After taking a sip, Robert asked,
"Now, tell me."
The man leaned forward.
"The neighboring kingdom's trader, Mr. Harris, wants wood from your forest."
Robert frowned.
"You mean smuggling?"
The man smiled.
"Mr. Harris will pay you a huge sum for each shipment."
Robert tapped his fingers on the table.
"I will have to discuss it with my friends first."
The man nodded.
"Of course."
With that, he stood and left. That night, Robert went to Charlie and said,
"Call Louis here."
Charlie turned to a servant.
"Send a message to Louis. We are waiting."
The servant hurried away. And soon, Louis arrived. Robert leaned forward.
"We have an offer."
He told them about it. Charlie said,
"This could be dangerous."
Louis added,
"What if the king finds out?"
Robert smirked.
"I have a plan. Don't worry."
Charlie nodded.
"All right, then."
Louis agreed. The next evening, the man came again. Robert said,
"Me and my friends agree. Mr. Harris is now our business partner."
The man smiled and left. That night, tea. 3 friends gathered in Robert's study. Robert said,
"We will cut the trees at night and hide them among the crop shipments."
Charlie and Louis nodded. A few nights later, they gathered their men in the forest. Robert whispered,
"Work fast but stay quiet. No mistakes."
One night, as men cut trees near Jonathan's hut, Jonathan and Lily woke up. Lily whispered,
"Dad, what's happening in our forest?"
Jonathan said.
"I should go check."
She grabbed his hand.
"No, Dad. Something is wrong."
Jonathan said calmly.
"Let me go, dear."
He stepped outside, and Lily followed. In the moonlight, they saw some men who were cutting trees. Jonathan shouted.
Who are you?
One man sneered.
Stay out of this. We are the minister's men. If you tell anyone, we will kill you.
Jonathan led Lily back inside. They couldn't sleep that night. One night, Robert, Charlie, and Louis sat in Robert's study. George, a servant, brought tea. As he reached the door, he overheard Robert say,
Don't worry. No one will find out we are smuggling wood.
George froze in shock. He knocked, entered the room, served the tea, and then left. That night, he thought,
I should do something.
An idea struck him. He wrote a letter. The next morning, he went to the palace and handed it to a guard for the prince. The guard handed it to the prince. That night, the prince read,
Your Majesty, some officials are smuggling wood. I can't reveal my name.
He closed the letter, deep in thought. The next day, the prince went into the forest. As he wandered, he saw many trees had been cut down. Ahead, he spotted a hut. A little girl sat outside. He went to her.
Can you tell me? Who is cutting the trees?
She scared. The prince smiled.
Don't be afraid. I'm the prince.
She said slowly.
The minister's men.
The prince was shocked. He returned to the palace and told the king. The king shouted,
Send the guards to arrest him!
The prince raised a hand.
We should investigate first. What if someone is framing him?
The king nodded, then called a spy.
Find out who is behind this smuggling.
He ordered. The spy bowed and left. The next day, the minister went to the palace. He told a servant,
Inform the king that I am here.
After a while, the servant returned, hesitating.
Your Excellency, the king refused to meet you.
The minister was shocked and went home. That night, he lay awake.
Something is fishy.
He couldn't sleep that night. After a week, the spy arrived at the palace. The spy said,
Your Majesty, the smugglers are 3 courtiers, Robert, Charlie, and Louis. They are friends and involved in the crime.
The king turned to the prince.
Arrest them at once.
The prince shook his head.
I want to catch them red-handed.
The spy added,
They often go to the forest on Saturday night.
The prince smiled. On Saturday night, the prince gathered the royal guards and divided them into 3 groups. He sent other groups to Charlie and Louis' house. Then, with his group, he headed to Robert's house and hid behind the trees. As soon as Robert stepped out, the prince shouted,
Guards! Arrest him!
The guards ran and grabbed Robert. Soon, other groups arrived at the palace with Charlie and Louis. The king with the minister stepped into the palace garden.
So, you were smuggling.
The king roared. They all fell to their knees.
Your Majesty, forgive us.
The king raised his hand.
Throw them in prison for life.
The guards dragged them away.